Breaking news this morning, the Supreme Court rejecting a bid to hear Ghislaine Maxwell's appeal. Maxwell argues she was unjustly prosecuted for her role helping Jeffrey Epstein recruit and groom girls as young as 14. In 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years behind bars for sex trafficking. And joining us now is Eric Fudali, who represents several Epstein accusers. Also with us, former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Barbara McQuade. Eric, first, your reaction to this big development.
Well, it's fantastic news. I mean, this is absolutely the right decision. What Ms. Maxwell's team tried to do is they tried really to turn one of the great travesties of injustice when it comes to child sex trafficking, the non-prosecution agreement by Alex Acosta, to allow Jeffrey Epstein to continue to abuse for another decade. They tried to use that to say, now you also can't prosecute Ms. Maxwell because technically she would have been included as a co-conspirator, and that would apply to the entire United States, even though it very clearly only applied to Florida. So that's what she tried to do. And thankfully, the Supreme Court did not buy it, just like every court did not buy it. It was a real Hail Mary argument. And on behalf of the victims, we're very pleased. I hope this is the last we hear of Ghislaine Maxwell, unless, of course, the news is that she's being transferred back to a more maximum security prison.
Have you heard it all from any of your clients at this point in reaction to this?
Certainly, yeah. They're relieved. Every time they have to hear Ms. Maxwell's name, remember, she was given this platform by the DOJ to just deny and tell her side of the story, which was nonsense. She got to be moved to this minimum security resort. We're really sick of this Ghislaine Maxwell special treatment, really sick of her getting a platform, and really sick of her being in the news. She doesn't deserve to be in the news. She deserves to be behind bars where child sex traffickers belong.
So, Barb, in a statement, here's what Maxwell's attorney says. This fight isn't over. Serious legal and factual issues remain, and we will continue to pursue every avenue available to ensure that justice is done. He doesn't elaborate on what he means by this fight isn't over. What could he mean? Could Maxwell take this challenge further in some way?
Yes, one of the things that a defendant has available to them, even after they have exhausted all of their rights to appeal, is to file a habeas corpus petition alleging that their confinement is in violation of the Constitution in some way. And so if you could say that someone's constitutional rights were deprived at some stage of the case, in this instance, perhaps this argument that we've just been discussing about the plea agreement that Alex Acosta signed. I don't think that there is any merit to any of them based on what we have seen. I agree that this last gasp legal challenge before the Supreme Court was the equivalent of a legal Hail Mary. But nonetheless, there is this, it's a civil process, a habeas process that could seek collateral relief from courts if there is a constitutional violation that occurred in the process of her prosecution.
Eric, are you prepared if Maxwell's team tries to take that approach?
Yeah, I'm prepared. I've been prepared for everything that comes out of this Epstein sort of debacle, you could call it, for the last few decades. There's almost zero chance that habeas corpus would work for Ms. Maxwell. She's going to be behind bars. She's going to be in prison where she belongs.
Unless she gets pardoned.
Unless she gets pardoned. And, I couldn't even think of the words to describe the devastation that would be to victims and survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ms. Maxwell if that was the case. But right now, I think we're all really pleased and hope this is the last we hear of Ms. Maxwell for a good time.
Barb, today is the first day of the new Supreme Court term, and the justices already are looking at a docket stacked with challenges to President Trump's policies and use of executive powers. Which cases are you watching most closely?
Well, I think most closely I will be watching the new emergency petitions that come from this administration. Already the court has taken more than 24 emergency petitions on the so-called shadow docket, and I imagine we'll see even more. But already docketed, I think the cases relating to presidential power are the most important and will have the longest implications in our country. One about President Trump's power to assess tariffs, that will be heard in November. And then also his ability to fire the heads of independent agencies. There's cases involving the FTC, the NLRB, and the Federal Reserve. Congress put checks and balances in there to require staggered terms, longer lengths, bipartisanship, and for-cause provisions. And President Trump has taken the position that as the executive, he has all of the executive power and gets to fire people as he pleases. So I think those are going to be some really monumental cases that come down.
So much for us to cover. Thank you, Barbara McQuade, Eric Fudali. Great to have you both with us.
This morning, breaking news shakes the country. The United States Supreme Court has officially rejected Ghislaine Maxwell's appeal. That means For now, the convicted accomplice of Jeffrey Epstein stays behind bars. But this story isn't over. In fact, it might just be getting darker. Because behind this quiet ruling lies one of the most disturbing legal sagas of the modern era, a tale of power, privilege, and predation, and a justice system that almost let it all slip away. Let's break it down. Imagine this. You're convicted of helping one of the most notorious sex traffickers in U.S. history, sentenced to 20 years for recruiting and grooming underage girls, and yet, you think you still deserve to walk free. That's exactly what Ghislaine Maxwell believed, and her lawyers took that argument all the way to the Supreme Court. But today, that door slammed shut. And for many survivors of Epstein's abuse, it's a moment of long-awaited relief. Let's start with what Maxwell's legal team actually tried to do. They argued that her prosecution was unfair because of a non-prosecution deal made years earlier between Epstein and the government. That deal, brokered in Florida by then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta, gave Epstein a sweetheart plea bargain. He got minimal jail time and avoided federal charges for trafficking minors. It was one of the most infamous deals in modern legal history, and now, Ghislaine Maxwell's team tried to use that very deal to claim she too should have been immune. They said that since she was an unnamed co-conspirator in the original case, the same protection should extend to her. It was a Hail Mary argument, and every single court before the Supreme Court rejected it, because that agreement only applied to Epstein's prosecution in Florida, not to Maxwell's crimes that stretched across multiple states, multiple victims, and multiple years. Still, she pushed all the way to the highest court in the land, and now with one quiet order, the Supreme Court said no. The moment that decision came down, victims' attorneys were ready. Eric Budali, who represents several Epstein survivors, didn't mince words. He called the Supreme Court's rejection fantastic news, he said. This was absolutely the right decision. Because for these survivors, every new appeal, every headline with Ghislaine Maxwell's name, means reopening old wounds, being forced to relive the trauma of what Epstein and Maxwell did. And Budali's words cut deep. He said, "We're really sick of this. Sick of the Ghislaine Maxwell special treatment. Sick of her getting a platform. She doesn't deserve to be in the news. She deserves to be behind bars and where sex traffickers belong." That line hit home. Because this case isn't just about legal arguments or procedural rights. It's about decades of pain. Girls as young as 14, manipulated, groomed, exploited, all under the watch of people with immense power and money. So when survivors hear that Ghislaine Maxwell is appealing, or giving interviews from prison or fighting for leniency, it doesn't feel like justice. It feels like betrayal. Now here's where things get interesting and maybe even alarming. After the Supreme Court's rejection, Maxwell's lawyer issued a short statement. He said, "This fight isn't over. Serious legal and factual issues remain, and we will continue to pursue every avenue available." What could that mean? Well, it might sound like defiance, but legally, there's still one last door she could try to pry open: a habeas corpus petition. That's a fancy Latin term meaning, my imprisonment is unconstitutional. It's a civil process, not a criminal appeal, where a prisoner argues that something about their conviction or confinement violated the Constitution. Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid broke it down perfectly. She said, "Yes, technically, Maxwell could still file a habeas corpus claim, but the chances of success, almost zero, because to win that, you'd have to prove something fundamentally unconstitutional happened during the case, like withheld evidence, jury misconduct, or a clear denial of rights, and none of that exists here." So when McQuaid called Maxwell's Supreme Court appeal a legal Hail Mary, she wasn't exaggerating. This was her last real shot. Now that it's failed, she's out of moves. Unless, as Budali hinted, she's banking on something even more controversial: a presidential pardon. Yeah, you heard that right. A pardon. Budali said he couldn't even describe the devastation that would cause. For victims, for survivors, for the public trust in justice itself. If someone were to step in and wipe away Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction, and it's not impossible, every president has that power, and in a political climate where loyalty often outweighs morality, you can see why the mere mention of the word pardon chills people. Could Maxwell be counting on that? Could her legal team be keeping her case alive just long enough for a friendly administration to intervene? We don't know. But it's not far-fetched. And that's exactly what scares the victims most. There's another reason survivors are angry, and it's not just about the legal filings. It's about how Maxwell has lived since being convicted. She's currently serving time in a low-security federal facility, what some have called a cushy prison environment, yoga classes, book clubs, vegan options. Far from the image of punishment that most people picture for a convicted sex trafficker. And then in 2023, she gave a televised interview from prison, denying everything. Blaming the media, claiming she was scapegoated. That appearance sparked outrage. For survivors, it felt like the justice system had handed Maxwell yet another platform, while the voices of her victims were pushed to the margins. That's why Budali said bluntly, "She doesn't deserve to be in the news. She deserves to be behind bars now. Zoom out." This case isn't happening in a vacuum. Today's rejection of Maxwell's appeal happened on the very first day of the new Supreme Court term. And this year's docket is stacked with cases that could redefine presidential power, including multiple challenges related to Donald Trump. We're talking about cases that question how much authority a president really has to impose tariffs, to fire agency heads, to reshape entire branches of the federal government. Barbara McQuaid warned that these aren't just bureaucratic issues. They're about the core structure of American democracy. Because if the court rules too broadly in favor of executive power, it could hand future presidents something dangerously close to unchecked control. Think about that. A president with full authority to fire independent regulators. A president who claims immunity from prosecution. A president who can wield the pardon power like a political weapon. Now imagine that same system being asked to consider a pardon for someone like Ghislaine Maxwell. That's not just legal drama. That's a moral crisis. So what does the Supreme Court's rejection actually mean? In simple terms, Ghislaine Maxwell stays where she is. Her 20-year sentence stands. Her legal road is, for all practical purposes, over. But symbolically, it means more. It's a rare moment where the justice system didn't bend for the powerful, where the Supreme Court didn't entertain a privileged defense wrapped in technicalities, where victims for once got to see the system side with them. It's not closure. It's not healing, but it's something. And for those who've lived through this nightmare, it's a reminder that sometimes, even slowly, justice does catch up. Still, there's an unease that lingers. Because even with Epstein dead and Maxwell convicted, the full web of accountability never really materialized. Where are the other names? The high-profile figures who flew on Epstein's jets? Who appeared on his island? Who turned a blind eye? Justice stopped with Ghislaine Maxwell, and that's the part of this story that refuses to die until the system can look beyond her and truly expose the network that enabled Epstein's crimes. When the victims may never feel like it's truly over. As of today, Ghislaine Maxwell sits in a federal prison cell. Her Supreme Court appeal denied. Her last-ditch hope fading fast. But her story is a mirror, a reflection of how power protects itself and how survivors must fight year after year just to be heard. Maybe that's why this ruling matters so much. Because it sends a message. Even the rich and well-connected can't appeal their way out of accountability forever. And as the Supreme Court gears up to tackle the biggest questions of presidential power, this case serves as a haunting reminder. Justice isn't guaranteed. It's something that has to be demanded. And today the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein got a small piece of it back. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit subscribe and stay tuned, because this Supreme Court term could redefine everything we thought we knew about justice in America.